All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here today. Super appreciate your time. This is the first iteration of the ESPC, also known as Emerging Scholars and Practitioners Committee Spotlight Series, which is coming from the ESPC Emerging Projects Grant Program. So this program is intended to fund in full or in part project expenses of TTTM ESPC members. And four museum or curatorial related projects were funded in the last cycle. And successful applicants have been asked to give a presentation, a workshop, or any other event of their choosing as a way to share their research with the wider TTTM community. So today is the first of three upcoming presentations. And so please stay tuned for more information about the upcoming presenters. And today we have Kacper Dziekan, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Concordia University with Thinking Through the Museum. And Kacper's PhD thesis is dedicated to Russian colonization of the Americas and cultural memory of Russian America in the USA, with academic interests in Russian history, colonialism, cultural memory, and borderlands. And professionally, Kacper's worked as a project coordinator for several public institutions and NGOs that have been involved in educational, cultural, social, historical, and civic projects, especially regarding post-Soviet countries and Central Eastern Europe. So now I'll pass it over to Kacper for his presentation.
Thank you very much, Alex, for your lovely introduction. And thank you all, Vada, Katrina, and for joining in today. Very happy to be sharing those results with you. Okay, can you all see my screen? Yep. Okay, I don't hear any no, so I take it as yes. So my project still working title is "The Two Ages of Russian Colonialism: a Comparative Research Project covering cultural memory, particularly museums of very broadly understood Russian colonial influence in two geographical areas: Alaska and also in the United States, and Podlasie, Eastern Poland on the other." And by considering as two edges of Russian colonialism, I would like to put together the example of classic settler colonialism that took place in Alaska with, let's say, less standard, more now debated interpretation of international, interethnic, national, yeah, it was also said that interethnic, international, or intercultural relations within East Central Europe, specifically on the what is now Polish Belarusian borderland in Podlasie region, but in between Poland and Russia or Poland, Belarus historically. So Russian Empire took its highest peak in mid-19th century. Generally speaking, while talking about Russian Empire historically as historical entity, we usually mean the period of 18th and 19th century. So from the Great Northern War that ended in 1721 by the victory of Russia until 1917, the October Revolution that ended the Tsarate. And this is the how empire looked like in its highest peak, which is in the 1860s. And that is after Russia conquered territories in the southeast, in what is now the such republics as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on, and Caucasus, and before selling Alaska, which took place in 1867, which is a closing point for a historical part of that of that part of the research, which is related to Alaska. This is when Russians, as a state, left. And by talking about Alaska, so this is the dates of the so-called Russian America. I'm saying so-called because this is how it generally called, but it's not how it was properly called within the Russian Empire. They would usually just use the term American colonies. And the dates spanning. You see the last date is quite easy because this is the year of the sale, 1867, and the early date here is 1784. I'm using the process of colonizing was, of course, more broad, was spanning into several decades, but this is very often used as the date when the first permanent settlement on Kodiak Island was founded, and I will be referring to that place quite a lot of times during this presentation because this is one of the main sites of memory when it comes to the Russian colonization of America, specifically of Alaska. And another thing when important to note when discussing Russian colonial presence in Alaska, this is this general notion of Alaska as a whole. So how is it now, how it exists as an administration wise, so as a state of Alaska within the United States, the entire territories, whereas in fact Russians were only they had only the settlements around the Aleutian Islands that you can see here on the bottom, and then there is this island, Kodiak Island, the one that I mentioned before, Kenai Peninsula, and several only few settlements on the east coast of Alaska, specifically the one town called now Sitka, which used to be called New Archangel. It would be the English translation of the Russian word. Why is it important? Because there is actually a very little territory where the Russian settlements were, where Russians were technically controlling, but where they were selling it to the United States, they were meant to sell much more. Um, in a way, pretending to control territories that were not belonging to them, and same time the United States took control over territories that were never even formally ceded one way or another, which is a very important aspect for the current perception of those territories in Alaska, specifically within those tribes or those indigenous groups that are inhabiting were inhabiting the territories where Russian colonizers showed up. So, as they sometimes point out, they were just seeing that their territories were being handed over from one colonizing power to another, because just like in many other cases, the for example, the Tlingit tribe in East Alaska, or the Sugpiaq or the Naina, were more of a sharing their custody over the land with the newcomers rather than giving it away to them. So very commonly, like in many other places. On the other hand, the Podlasie region, so the one in Poland, Kesi is located now it's very east of Poland with the main city Białystok in it. When importance of this region in the Polish-Russian relations, Polish-Belarusian-Russian relations, as well as the local specificity, is that when the partitions of Poland took place in 1970s, from 70s to 1770s to 17 early 90s, so the end of 18th century, so more or less the same period when the Russians started their permanent settlements in Alaska. So this is one of the reasons why I wanted to look at those places together. So the same period when Russians start colonizing, putting permanent settlements in Alaska, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was conquered and divided by Austria, Prussia, and Russia. And the final act of it was in 1815 at the Vienna Congress. You can see where the borders shifted a bit. So the former Polish-Lithuanian territories, more of them were actually given to Russia. And on some part of it, as you can see, the Kingdom of Poland was created back then, which was a just an administration unit really within Russian Empire. So it didn't have any autonomy. But it technically had a separate entity within Russian Empire. But the region of Podlasie was incorporated into Russian Empire, the main part of it, let's say. So it didn't belong to the Kingdom of Poland. So this is quite important and it distinguishes also it from the most of the country, of the rest of the country that belong to Russian Empire. Sorry, that belong to the Kingdom of Poland within the Russian Empire. I hope it's not too confusing. If something is unclear, please let me know. I just wanted to make this introduction for you to have a better understanding of of the places on the ground. Um, and since this such a territorial expansion of Russia took place in the 19th century, it's one of the main aspects of it that stayed. Actually, the main legacy that stayed is the Orthodox Church. And in the case of Alaska, the the Russian missionaries followed, the Orthodox missionaries followed the settlers quite quickly in the early 19th century, early 1800s. Whereas in the case of Podlasie or Poland is a bit more complicated because this is the region of the territory where the Orthodox Church has been present for centuries. But when these territories became part of where the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was actually came to be in late 1500s or late 16th century, um, there was a special law imposed by the Polish king on the it's the Orthodox subjects to merge with the Catholic Church, creating something called Greek Orthodoxy there, although it didn't have anything to do with Greece, but it called Greek Orthodoxy, also known as the Union in Polish, because it was a Union of Brest. So when Russia came there in late 18th, early 19th century, they terminated the union, and this is when the narratives differ because they, according to general Polish national narrative, they forced the union or the Greek Catholic community to convert to the Orthodoxy, but as we show in some of the next examples, for local memory in Podlasie region, it's seen rather differently. They seen as they were given the opportunity to come back to the Orthodoxy that they were part of before they became the Unionites. So this is kind of a one example of this difference between the national memory in Poland and the local memory in Podlasie, which comes from this division of them being directly under Russian influence 19th century, so belonging to the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church at that time. Although, see, this is the memory that is not specifically seeing Russian um, imperial presence or colonial presence as something positive or good, but this is related specifically with the orthodoxy. And as I like to show in a moment, this is very, or maybe not very, but somewhat similar to the situation in Alaska. So, even though those cases are very different, obviously, with very, you see, it's a very different background story because the Orthodox Church in Alaska obviously the settlers came with the colonizers to a very different culture. Um, and in Podlasie, it actually has been there before, so the colonizers only allowed it to to come back or to thrive, but the communities embrace the church. And now when it comes to Alaska, what's visible all around the sites of the former Russian colonial sites or the mnemonic agents that share the Alaskan history, like this. What is seen that the Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church, is seen differently than the general Russian colonial presence. And here I'm showing you the examples from the Anchorage Museum in Anchorage, in Alaska. So Anchorage, the city, was basically created after World War II. So it doesn't have its direct colonial presence. It wasn't also built on any specific settlement or village settlement of indigenous communities, how it was with other ones where Russians were building them. Nevertheless, as a main city in Alaska, it hosts the Anchorage Museum, which tells the story of Alaska. So also, it tells the story in the way as it's more and more common within Alaska, where the colonial period is just a period within the broader history of thousand years of human presence and human cultural presence in Alaska. It focuses on telling specific stories of different specific indigenous communities, as well as the more general story of the region or the state with also the external presence of with the occupation, either Russian and then American, because the those two occupations are actually seen in a certain way as a linear joint perspective of just white settler um, occupation, rather Russian, or either Russian or American, but in many cases similar. So the Russian Orthodox Church is something that also is presented there. Maybe I should add that the Anchorage Museum is created by the by it was within the Smithsonian Institute, the Arctic Center, but this exhibition, just like most of its um, most of its work is being done by the local expert museum team, which consists of experts and curators, all coming from the Alaska Native Nations. And here they also present how this legacy and this history is commemorated in their oral history. And in this, the religious legacy, as I was saying, is seen as the positive one, because what's emphasized is that once the Orthodox missionaries showed up, they, unlike the many main settlers, the one that were dealing with trade or other administration tasks. So unlike them, the missionaries were not a bit brutal. On the contrary, they're actually trying to stop the brutality of the settlers, and also they took a keen interest in the local cultures, trying to reach to them through their culture. So they were learning the languages, and they were also translating the script, or translating the different the different what they call the sacred writings into native languages. So also the first written sources of either Sugpiaq or the Naina languages. So the main two that I will be talking about today in this in the Kodiak Island and Kenai Peninsula that one was focusing on, but also in the Tlingit language in southeastern Alaska, and the New Archangel was. The first written primary sources are with Cyrillic alphabet, Cyrillic script. Only later on they were changed into Latin alphabet. And here I'm showing a few examples of it from the St. Herman Orthodox Theological Seminary in Kodiak. Um, when those prayers are being hanged on the wall in the seminary, and they are presented here with with several languages. You see Tlingit, Slavonic, but also they also Aleut language in both Cyrillic and Latin alphabet. I think it's important to show now that the Orthodox Church or Orthodoxy in general, since it was so strongly embraced by the Native Alaskan population all around the colony. So in all those four main sites of the Aleutian Islands, were mostly Aleut people, in the Kodiak Island by the or local Sukpiak or Alutik, as the other name is. I will also go back to it later. Sukpiak Alutik nation, then the Naina or Kenites in the Kenai Peninsula, and Tlingit population in the Tlingit in Southeast Alaska. And on top of that, there is a high Orthodox population among the Yupik community, although Russians never reached Yupik the territory. So this is like an interesting example how the religion spread already without going above the whole administration, settler colonialism, also reaching to those areas um, where the colonizers never came. And in fact, now big amount of Orthodox congregations in Alaska consist of Yupik people, and also the language was, since the Yupik language was preserved, given the fact that they were so far away. So when the Americans came after the Russians, the 19th century, the Americanization was a bit weaker on the northern part, and thanks to this, the Yupik language managed to be preserved more strongly than the other ones. So there is a lot of services also in Yupik language. And for example, in the seminary that I visited last April as part of my research, and also thanks to the grant of ESPC emerging projects. The many members of the seminary were actually of Yupik Nation, and they were also during the Eastern period, they were praying in Yupik, but also in Tlingit or in Aleut, as I was mentioning before. So this is the main, the striking legacy, the religion that was brought by the colonizers. It was part of the much broader colonial also forced colonial knowledge, forced colonial way of life, but it was eventually embraced, and today by most of the Alaska nations, this is seen as part of their identity. The situation in Podlasie, in a way, has certain similarity, because also the Orthodoxy is an important part of local identity. I put here Russian Orthodox Church in the brackets, because as much as in Alaska they are using the term Russian Orthodox Church, actually the church is called Russian Orthodox Church still there, although officially it's Orthodox Church of America. It has no connections with Russia anymore, but still historical sites are called Russian Orthodox Church in Alaska. Um, Whereas in Podlasie, the local Orthodox is now it's a Polish Orthodox Church, and usually they just call them, or as you can see in the on the photograph here, this is a plaque from the church in the town, in the village called Puchły. Most of those Orthodox churches were preserved in the small settlements around Podlasie, so they call it just Orthodox Church. By this way, um, they don't they show there is no connection with the Russian Orthodox Church, which is quite important in terms of memory politics and memory culture in East Central Europe, but specifically in Poland, for the reason when Russian Orthodox Church is seen as one of the say weapons of Russian imperialism, as a way of influencing. Therefore, Orthodox people are being targeted even though who are those who are not anyhow related to the Russian Orthodox Church, such is the case in Podlasie. And so this is one of the reasons what also strengthens the local identity that there's been throughout many decades insulted or through different ways being targeted as some sort of a fifth column or a kind of suspected residence. Whereas in the local memory, the Orthodox Church is also seen as actually the one that is their own. So, similar like in Alaska, but with the difference that it's part of, let's say, with the borders or the how this church came to be. It's not as clear as within the again the classic colonization when church was brought with the Russian colonizers. Here it existed before. The period of Russian presence gave its possibility to develop. Um, and also, I think it's an interesting aspect of how it's presented. Whereas in generally in the Polish historiography and the memory politics of of the time, the dates of the partitions that I mentioned, those in the late 18th century, they've been always emphasized as this kind of turning points. And here you can see, or you can read in it when they discuss the story of the village and the church, there is no mentioning about the partitions, which I think is quite interesting and quite non-typical for the from let's say the history writing or periodization within the Polish settlements. And I think that's my interpretation that this is related to the fact that for the local residents they didn't change much, the change of statehood, and in fact for the development of the church was actually beneficial, but then again they don't want it to sound as if it was the impact, general impact of the Russian colonization or the like, imperial expansion was positive. It's only related to the development of the church. So I think is a way of focusing on it. It's just not mentioned, and the dates are more related to the actual turning points within the building itself. Um, and another and elements of this memory now with this central city of Podlasie, which is Białystok, is the I would say the and non-existence of this legacy. So here, for example, is the Orthodox Church as a non-site of memory. This is the plaque which is on the street. Really, it's not marked very much. You can even very easily miss if you just walk down the street. This is the spot where the Orthodox Russian Orthodox Church stayed there, and even after Poland regained its independence in 1918, it was still there. You can see the date here is of 1930. So the church stayed till World War II. It was destroyed or demolished during the war, and it wasn't rebuilt. On one hand, could be related to the communist regime that came after, and which was generally trying um, to um, to suppress religions in general, but I think that it also had a lot to do with the fact of strong colonization of the territory, of imposing the general Polish national narrative there, because Catholic churches were doing quite okay, and Catholic churches there were no new churches, but the historic Catholic churches were being rebuilt during the communist period. However, however contradictory it may sound, but that was the reality. Whereas the temples of other denominations, such as synagogues or Protestant churches or Orthodox churches or mosques, were not really rebuilt. Then this is an example of it, of such non-sites of memory. So it fits into the story of making Białystok a very typically Polish city, where in fact this is the city that basically developed in last 19th century, so during the Russian period, and it was very multicultural. And there are some, you can follow the path of Jewish Białystok now. You can follow the path of generally intercultural Białystok. But there is no path of Russian Białystok, even though there were, a lot of such examples. So I think this is also the an example of how this uniqueness of Podlasie region is not really resembled in its main city in Białystok. So the photos and the slides I showed before were from the villages or small settlements where the local memory and local community is strong, and also the residents, the same family has been living there for generations. Whereas in the main city in Białystok, there was a big, social mobility, and such memory is less strong, and the Russian period is more easier, is easier wiped out as part of unwanted heritage. Another element of Russian legacy are related to the language, the linguistic elements, and to education. And I think important, interesting thing about Alaska, this is the photos that you can see here are part from the Kenai Chamber of Commerce and Visitor Center. So the one I showed before were from the Kodiak Island, and now we have a Kenai Peninsula. So this is the second of those places within Alaska that were important for the Russian colonization. And there is no museum in Kenai Peninsula that would talk about history, though the Chamber of Commerce and Visitor Centers is actually the closest to the museum that is there. There is cooperation. There is a historical society, Kenai Historical Society, that cooperates with them. Although there is no big work on the Russian colonial period, the historical society has a bigger focus on the so-called the homestead period. So after World War II, when there were a lot of, well, mostly white American settlers being sent from the mainland US to populate Alaska. But the current curator at the visitor center has started the monthly rotating exhibit with different topics. And when I was there in April, the topic was education. And they were also showing the examples of Russian education, because actually Russian educated survived the Russian statehood there, if I can say so, because when Alaska was sold to the US in 1867, um, it was mostly military that took over. And just like the Russian presence in Alaska was very small, there were like a couple of hundreds of settlers, of permanent settlers in all those territories. So actually, there were always many more indigenous nations in all sides, so Tlingit or Sugpiaq or Dena'ina or Aleut, which were used by or taken advantage of, and sometimes even in a way of enslavement by the Russian colonizers to work, mostly to hunt for sea otters and other animals. That was the main source of profit. Um, and also, when the Americans took over, there were very limited number of military men who came, and especially a bit in the locations a bit further of the main place, like the main city, so Sitka, now New York Angels in Russian times, and Kenai Peninsula was a bit further, Kodiak too. So some Russians or Russian-speaking, either Alaska Native nations or the so-called Creole, so the descendants of male Russian settlers mostly, and indigenous women who had a special status within the Russian Empire, and they were meant to be some sort of like intermediaries. But they became one of the main group that stayed. They were mostly Orthodox. They had Russian names, and they were Russian speaking, and they actually continued the education in the former colony, which was done in Russian. And in Kenai there was a Russian school, as you can see, and some of those schools continued the instructions in Russian until World War One, at least. Some of them were in Russian or in English. And the difference was what's emphasized also in Anchorage Museum and also in many other oral histories if of all those groups that I mentioned, so Yupik or Sukpiak or Denaina or Tingit or Aleut, the Russians also running classes in those languages those groups I mentioned, whereas the American schools were actually only forcing instructions in English and had this much stronger attempt to eradicate and to to run what is now mostly called the cultural genocides, just like you probably know the more I think well-known stories from Canada. In Alaska, it was similar, maybe to the bit not such an extreme as in Canada, but also quite horrible. And this is one of the reasons why some elements of the Russian period are better remembered, because um, the within church, so also a big part of this education was done within the Orthodox Church. There was more space given to preserving local languages and cultures. And for example, yes, this is the case of this Russian school in Kenai. And as I was saying, that even through 20th century, those schools existed. This is the example of saying that how they were learning in Slavonic, English, Russian. In this case, this is only focusing on European languages coming from Europe. But in other examples, there were different stories. As some form of recapitulation of the memory presented within the museum practices. So this is the Kodiak History Museum, one of the two main museums in on Kodiak. On Kodiak Island, there is a town called Kodiak, and it hosts two main museums, which is Kodiak History Museum, and the other is Alutik Museum, which the division, the Alutik Museum, tells the very broad story of the Alutik people and the Alutik nation and the history of the island, whereas Kodak History Museum has a more linear story of specifically um, colonial, post-colonial history with some introduction to before, but the idea was that since the Alutik Museum covers the much broader picture, it tells a lot of stories within the Alutik nation, the Kodiak History Museum took more of the colonial stories, so that's why I took some of those examples. And here, it is done, by the way, in cooperation, the narratives on the museum. And here is also another narrative showing the positive example of the Orthodox Church, and also showing out the development of education and language in Kodiak. But to not to make this story sound too positive and again kind of romanticized, there is a big emphasis on the expo of how the colonials were taking advantage of the in this case, Aleut culture. This is an excerpt from the gallery where there are different characters, and one of the characters is the Aleut slave, and it just shows there was a form of enslavement done by the colonizers towards the indigenous population, specifically of the Aleut people, because they best hunters, and that's why they were the Russians needed them. And not one note. Here they mean specifically Aleuts from the Aleutic Islands, but in the colonial times, Russians were using the name Aleuts to describe several different groups, including also the Aleutic or Sukha people. Um, so sometimes it could be a tricky term. But as wrapping those things up, in Kodiak History Museum, even though they take a linear course of the island's history, mostly in the last 250 years. There's definitely the strengthened indigenous voice and perspective, especially compared to the previous incarnations of the museum. I had a chance to go through the archives of the museum and to see some photos and and description of collections in the past that were done in a very kind of old school colonial way, with making a romantic image of this interesting, unique history of Russians being in America. So there is definitely a different approach now, and the story, even though it focuses on the 19th and 20th century, it's told also from the point of view um, indigenous nations, and mostly they're from the Sugpiaq or Alutiiq group, as they are the main one, and Kodiak Island. And what's important here, so they in the last in the exhibition has been done a couple of years ago, and also there's been with bigger involvement of local community. Um, and as part of those elements of legacy that's left, for example, as one of the symbols of Russian presence was is seen as the kettle, which is a chainik in Russian, but also shows that how Russian language influenced the Alutiiq language, because they can see Tsainik. This is the second word here is in Alutiiq language, and it's influenced by the Russian words. As just in this case, kettle was a colonial item that was introduced by the Russians who were drinking tea a lot, and therefore how it was passed over. So this is shown as also as an example of those intercultural influences, but also the description in it shows also what was the character of the colonization, and even with the historical source, so showing how this control and and um, and the control taking advantage of, but also exploitation of a local nation looked like. And important aspect on it in the telling the story of the colonization, and that's why also this year of 1784 that I showed in the beginning is important, because the story of permanent settlement started with a one huge massacre that was very much diminished in Russian sources, or even in general Western sources. There was in old books there was a mentioning of some skirmishes or a battle, but within in the local memory in Kodiak, there is this just very broadly remembered story of a horrible massacre that took place when the Russian party, led by one of when there's the Grigory Shelikhov, just out of anger for the resistance they met, they slaughtered the local residents who were seeking refuge in the so-called refuge rock. And this is absolutely a turning point in the lieu de mémoire thing in the Lutik Sugpiaq memory, because this is a very direct example of very direct colonial violence that then being silenced and could only be brought on a broader scale very recently. So, and one of the entry points of the exhibition in Kodiak History Museum, there is a story of the massacre. Of course, in the Alutik Museum, there is also a whole section on this massacre, and this is a very blunt example of the colonial violence. And now, well, I've several times was using the word Sukpiak/Alutik. I think this is the good example of how also this colonial influence took place. Saying Russians use the word Aleuts to describe different peoples, and actually the word with which the local nation use also to describe themselves now is also alutik, as you can see here, which is I think an interesting example because there's the Russian word aleuts in Russian be aliute, and it's just for this is how it's spelled in with Latin alphabet, well, let's say in English language of Alutik Sukpiak nation, how to them sounded the Russian word. So they transformed it to their language and then transformed it into English. In a way, ended up with the word Alutik. So also this is a explanation for that in the museum to show those kind of relations. Um, on the other hand, the Museum of Podlasie, it would be actually the main museum dealing with Russian history in the Podlasie region. As I was saying before, Białystok is a main city, but also it's a place where the national story is actually dominating, really, unlike in those small settlements. And so, for example, unlike in the case of Alaska, either in Kodiak or Kenai, but it's mostly seen in Kodiak Island and Kodiak museums, where the local perspective, in this case, the Sukpiak Alutik perspective, is the key one, is the one that definitely overshadows the Russian colonial story. In Białystok, it's not the case. So the Russian colonial story is definitely it's you could one visitor can has a impression how problematic it is, even though this is the city who actually developed during the Russian period, because before they were just goods of local aristocrats, and yet there is no full story of the local development. The museum mostly consists of different elements. It's kind of a mansion that is made to look like it's 19th century. So there are some Russian elements. We'll show them in a second, but basically there is not much of a narrative. There is not much of explanation. It's more of a like visiting a old noble house, really. With one main exception, this is the story of the Ritz Hotel, which was a 19th century the most lavish hotel in Białystok, which was very much connected to the Russian imperial development, and it doesn't exist anymore. So saying this whole Russian legacy within the city is not really seen, but there's a model of it in the museum, and there are some stories of it. So this is just the one main thing. And as I was saying, so there is no really local perspective, but they do try to engage the local community, but in a kind of like, again broader national way. This is how the building looks like. So this is the manner was preserved. It wasn't destroyed during the war, but you can see the whole area around is not. So it was chosen as a site for the historical museum, probably because it's a historical building. And this is also how they kind of use the the specific parts of the exhibition. So there could be some items, some elements just with Russian language as an kind of a reminder that the Russia was there, but it's definitely not any kind of a central story within the exhibition that is actually dedicated to that period. So there is definitely kind of missing part there. Um, and the final part of this elements of legacy, also with the language. There is this phenomenon known in Polish as bieżeństwo, which they translate into English as just Exodus. It took place in 1915. Most it started so at the beginning of World War One, and the word bieżeniec or bieżeńcy in Russian means just the refugees. It's very used in modern context, but in Polish, it only exists in this specific context. So only for to describe people who were fleeing their homes in 1915 when the worst World War One started, and they had stories about the Austro-Hungarian army approaching and killing everyone on the way. So they were fleeing towards inner Russia, and it's connected to the Russian colonialism or the Russian presence there, because for the local residents, it was just that they were running away from the potential enemies, and this is something very local. It doesn't really exist in the Polish general memory, really within the main national scale. But it's very strong. There are many references to it in the region, in the towns, and also linguistically wise as a legacy. Was interesting to know that, as you can see here, this main part is written in Polish. There is an English translation and the Russian translation. Just like here, there are two crosses from Orthodox parishes in Stary Kornin and Chrześcianka. Those are the villages where the Orthodox churches are, and the inscriptions on those crosses are in Russian, which is not that common because there's a very linguistic mosaic there. Locals, residents speak, you see, their variation of Belarusian language, probably, really, which they just call the local language, or they speak Polish. And in some other places, the parts of certain inscriptions are in this local variation of the Slavic language, or in local variation of Belarusian, or in Polish, but Russian is not really common. So this part with bieżeństwo, which is strongly associated with this presence within the Russian Empire, the Russian history, is kind of like an exception for it. And the last part of it, we see I'm going a bit over time, is the thing is the so-called contested legacy and nostalgia. So um, now, contemporarily, the Russian colonial imperial presence in the site is generally very contested. Also in Alaska and in Podlasie. In Podlasie, because it's a part of the broad perception of Russia as an ever. So in Poland, Russia is seen as a potential aggressor generally, and especially the last years, and specifically since 2022, and the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine is not just potential aggressor; it's seen as an actual aggressor, as an existential threat to the security, the safety. So the very few that exist in most examples of certain nostalgia over Russia are very much contested. And an example that I'm showing here is from the town Białowieża, which is probably the only place in Poland which you can see some elements of it, because it was basically like a hunting spot for the Russian Tsars in 19th century. And as a kind of reminder of it, one of the local businesses opened something called the Tsarist restaurant. And also thought that, remember, this is very unique for Poland because and again, the general perception of the Russian period is seen as very negative. So as exactly as colonial in the sense of, applying the post-colonial perspective to East Central European history as something that was just bringing destruction, and again, within the perspective as something that was bringing exploitation of people and resources, that was bringing forced Russification and threat to any kind of local national identity and culture. And That's why this example is quite unique. And this restaurant, this is the photo I took in it last spring, so in May 2024. And you can see on the over the door of the restaurant there are two flags, Polish and Ukrainian flag, which is quite mm, it's called the Tsarist restaurant, and then you have Polish-Ukrainian flag. So generally, the reason for it is they were afraid of being seen as being sympathetic towards Russia, or even some sort of someone who could try to romanticize the Russia in general, because I mean the way they created the restaurant was like a romanticized image of the Tsarist Russia, like the photo of the samovar, the tea, big tea making machine that is like a very symbol of, let's say, Russian Tsarist nostalgia. So in order to show how they are, so they are not supporting Russia, and how they just placed Polish and Ukrainian flag in this, trying to show the support. But generally, this is very contested, and there are many local residents have very negative interpretation or negative perception of this restaurant, seeing it as a more of like an idea to bring tourists and to make money on that kind of heritage, which in case of Alaska would be similar in a way where also the Russian colonial legacy is very negative. It contested because now in a traditional colonial sense, it comes with exploitation, it comes with diseases, it comes with the subjugation of the local population, with destruction the traditional ways of living, and the forced specification and the disappearing local cultures. But among the non-indigenous population of Alaska, there's been a romantic image built of Russia, especially in the period until World War II, before the Cold War, when Russia became an enemy towards the US. This is when actually it took a semi-similar form to Poland, that it was kind of like a legacy that is problematic because it was left by our existential enemies in this case, but also it looked like cool for some people because you would normally associate European colonialism with Britain, France, and Spain, and then you have Russia. So there were examples or attempts to make it kind of to sell it out to potential tourists, not only foreign ones, but also from the other parts of the US or Canada or whoever was coming to Alaska, to show this uniqueness of Alaska with having this Russian heritage of how romantic it could be. An example of it is what I found in the archives of the Kodak History Museum. There was a play that's been shown, as you can see, from the big part of Cold War era. Actually, it lasts until the 90s. I believe it was called The Cry of the Wild Ram. And just the one explanation, the first chief manager of Russian American company, so the entity that was managing the colony, his name was Alexander Baranov, and Baran in Russian is ram. So his name was, had the ram in it. So this wild ram was kind of supposed to resemble the first chief manager, called sometimes as just a governor, and who is, for example, in the Tlingit memory. I wasn't focusing today much of the Tlingit nation who live in southeastern Alaska, where the capital was, which were very much influenced by Baranov. They have the very negative memory of this character. So now he's been basically, his commemoration is kind of disappearing in general around Alaska. So that example of this very nostalgic kind of romantic image of him and his story, you can even read through some of those excerpts of this play. It was very colonial in its way, and it was kind of an attempt to build this kind of a local identity in Alaska around this kind of unique, cool Russian Russian past. But in the 90s or early 2000s, it was eventually abandoned under after the backlash and the pressure of in the Sukyakaloti community, but also more and more people were just realizing that this is nowhere to go with it. So now, again, like in both places in Alaska and in Podlasie, this nostalgic image of Russia is really disappearing and being replaced with rather with more focus on just the local history, but with differences in case of Alaska of local culture being really disrupted by the European or by the Russian or American scene as the kind of European powers or Western powers in the sense of coming from far away, who just challenged the local life. But in Podlasie, it's more of a seen as on two layers: on the national Polish level, as the everlasting Russian threat, and on the local level, of it kind of attempt to operate in between, actually also dominating narratives, the now dominating national Polish one, and in the past Russian one. And I think I will finish with that. Thank you for staying with me. And if you have comments, questions, and feedback, I'm very happy to listen to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Casper. If anybody has any questions, comments, feel free. There's only 8 of us here, so feel free to just turn on your video or not and just ask your questions directly or any comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much for this presentation. I thought it was really interesting. I had a question about one of the terms that you used describing one of the, I think it was a church in Poland. You called it a site of non-memory. I was wondering if you, or sorry, a non-site of memory. I was wondering if you can expand on that and if it like relates at all to Pierre Nora's idea of sites of memories or Jung's idea of counter monuments.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. Yes, it refers to Pierre Nora really, rather than the counter. So yes, it's actually like a reversed Nora, and actually it's been developed by Roma Sendica from our team. Also, she had this. You can find her paper on non-sites of memory. I can even send you it later on if you're interested. But exactly, this is, let's say, the concept. So Roma basically focuses on actually Holocaust memory in Poland, but this is a good starting point for other forms of memory culture. I would say, especially in the context of East Central Europe, when there's been a lot of statehood changes, a lot of social mobility, but also a lot of destruction for all sorts of reasons. So there's been a lot of sites of memory that were destroyed or they just disappeared, never to be rebuilt. And in many cases, it was just convenient. So this is, then again, it's very often related to Holocaust, or let's say to Jewish historical presence, because there were so many Jewish people in East Central Europe, and now there's hardly any remains of them. Not on in terms of material culture. So there are several plaques showed up. For example, here there was what kind of life existed here before, and those is often referred to as a non-site of memory because it is in the memory. Like it could be passed throughout some generations when people know that there was that the landscape here was very different, but it's been either on purpose or not really on purpose, but it's been wiped out. It just disappeared, and it's been replaced with something else. And that's why I use this the example of this Orthodox church in Białystok, because this is, I think, an interesting example of how different is, in this case of Podlasie, the main city, from the small settlements in which those churches either preserved or they were rebuilt, or this is like their actual sites of memory. This is part of the local memory, and the main city is not. It's like any regular major Polish city with mostly Catholic in terms of religious sites, mostly Catholic churches. and it's, it's never been, has been like this. And that's why I'm saying this is the memory of multiculturality, of those differences. In this case, also of Russian colonial or imperial presence, because the city was developed when it was part of Russia, is gone and it's not really mentioned. That's why I'm referring to it as a non-site of memory.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Right. I also have one question. There was an image that you showed. It was a bust of a woman, and she was a slave woman. Like the description said that she's a slave woman, something. But you also talked about strengthening of indigenous voices within the museum. Maybe I misunderstood it or something, but I'm just trying to understand how are these indigenous stories of violence being excavated and these people being humanized because she wasn't named, right? She was an anonymous person. And I'm thinking, is there a similar effort that we have seen in by Black scholars to kind of bring out the human element of these stories and to give them a name and to give them a presence, right? So, is there something similar happening in terms of the local struggle?
Well, thank you very much for this question. And actually, I would say in general, yes. In this particular case, no. And I will explain you why. It's actually my mistake. I'm sorry for this. But your question actually made me realize the mistake I made. I need to correct it in the presentation because the bust doesn't present an Sukpiaks or Lutik or or any other indigenous woman. It's actually I just put those two photos together, juxtaposing them. I should have probably explained it better because the bust is actually of the empress. This is the Russian empress, Catherine the second on it. So it's really it's undersigned there, but I was just trying to use different examples, and I think they didn't mention this particular bust. I focused on the story of this Aleut slave. It's actually there's been a depiction of, in this case, of the male slave or enslaved person. So I'm saying this particular case is just my poor choice of or poor selection of things to show. But in general terms, yes, I would say that there is very similar tendency as in other those post-colonial context, that exactly that the history has been written or been seen in Western sources from the point of view of Russian settlers. And yes, and exactly I was talking about the Creoles. So this is where the offsprings of Russian male settlers and indigenous women, in which case they were either forgotten or they were or Russianized, so they were given Russian names, and they were um, very often trying to be presented as just Russian. That sometimes in archival sources it's hard to really tell who was who. And but in now, for example, in the other museum I mentioned, the Alutik Museum, which tells a story different symbols. They're to find out more and to name and to bring more agency also in terms of like actual positional and naming of different individuals.
Thank you so much.
So maybe if just 1 second to on the bed is another it's a story from a different part. The one I wasn't talking much, wasn't researching now a lot, but I did for my PhD. And for example, for the Tlingit culture, so the nation around the former capital, they very much focus on individuals who were like key figures for their for struggle, and they're building a lot of narratives around those individuals, and also when the stories are being told on totem poles. Whereas for Sukpiak or the Naina culture in Kenai and Kodiak, they don't have the culture of totem poles, so it's not there. But the totem poles in for example in the Tlingit area, they also focus on those sometimes individual stories through the.
Any last questions, anyone? I think probably this is the last call.
It could also be, some feedback for me that doesn't have to be a question. If you have anything you'd like to share.
Definitely.
I just wanted to say thank you so much, Casper. I learned so much today. I didn't really know much about anything on this topic, so it was really fascinating, and I thought you did a great job. And yeah, this was just awesome. So it was a great start to my morning and to my week. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. Thank you. That's very nice.
Okay, well, if there aren't any other comments, I think, do you feel good to wrap up then, Casper?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so thanks you so much everyone for for dedicating your time to come and listen, your mornings or afternoons, super regular, depending where you are. It was a pleasure for me to talk to you, and I'm happy that you liked it. And also, if there's anything that comes to your mind later on, for example, if you have any critical thoughts, or any other, constructive feedback that you'd like to share, or and if you have, I know everyone is busy, but and if you have find some time and you would like to share it over email or something, I would appreciate that too. But anyhow, it's great, and I think Alex, you mentioned about the recording, right? Or
yeah, exactly. Yeah, we'll be posting
sometimes
this.
next week, right?
Yeah, by next week we'll be posting it on the website. And I also just want to say, I mentioned it at the beginning, but I think a few people weren't here at the beginning, that this is the first of three presentations that are emerging from the ESPC Emerging Projects Grant. And so just stay tuned for more. We're going to be sending out an email in the coming weeks with probably some doodles and dates for the next presentations. We're really looking forward to it. So thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you all soon.
You. So see you. Have a good day or the evening and a nice week.
Take care.